Maiden Voyages, Virginia and Florida, summer of 2002, age 22. When Dad met me in Crisfield to help take the boat over to Narrows, it was a hot morning and flies buzzed and gathered on the dock where someone had left a piece of bait or landed a fish. The seagulls were quiet and the water was still, but by 7 a.m. it was already close to 90 degrees. Mom dropped him off and helped him carry his tools down the dock. I had the Honda engine running to warm up, and had gotten the boat as ready as I could. The sail covers were off, which I thought was probably a little optimistic, considering that there wasn't any wind, and I'd chilled iced tea and Gatorade in a cooler, and prepared turkey sandwiches ahead of time. It would be a full day's trip, even under power, and I wanted to be sure I had thought of everything. As we left the harbor and glided into Tangier Sound, it occurred to me that this was the first time since my dad and I had taken delivery of the new Chenoo that we had been alone together on a boat. And this boat was much smaller. I wondered what he thought of me now. I'd finished college, which seemed to be the thing that he had wanted for me most, and the thing that makes most parents forgive their kids for all the stupid or self-destructive shit they've done in the past. I'd been accepted into every graduate creative writing program that I applied to, most likely because I'd applied to the ones that I thought were attainable, and had decided on Florida International University's Master of Fine Arts program because it had famous Florida mystery writers whose work I admired as faculty. I'm sure Dad would have rather me have gone to law school or medical school, but since he'd had a successful second career as a writer, he couldn't very easily advise me not to make writing my first career. An hour out, the outboard sputtered and died. We drifted in the wide open stretch of water as I searched the outboard's carburetor for the small screws that would adjust the airflow and therefore the amount of gas that was pulled through the contraption. Dirty jets, Dad said, as I started the engine back up and kept the choke engaged longer than I normally would. Yup, easy enough to fix, right? We just need to get to Narrows. You've fixed an engine or two before. Dad smiled and sat back in the comfortable cockpit, and I noticed for the first time what a small man he was. Thin, spindly legs and arms, graying hair where the matted brown used to be, shorter than average height. He seemed perfectly content even on a 28-foot sailboat with engine problems in the middle of Tangier Sound. Did I ever tell you about the time I got stuck on Tangier? He asked. He had, but we talked about it again anyway. As a boy, he'd taken his skiff out from West Point and somehow found his way out the York River and all the way across the Chesapeake, where he'd broken down on Tangier Island. He'd had to stay a few days until the part for his outboard was shipped in. His mother was frantic. The outboard sputtered and cut off a few more times, but finally whatever dirt was blocking the carburetor seemed to push through and it ran smoothly. When we reached the bay, the wind picked up just enough to put the mainsail up, and I had Dad hold the boat into the wind as I stood on top of the cabin and pulled on the halyard to raise the sail. It was easy work, and I was learning that most things that required physical labor were easier on a small boat than a large one like Chenoo. After motor sailing for an hour, we put the jib up and cut the motor, and cruised along under sail. With very little wind, the handheld GPS that Dad had brought clocked us at 2.5 knots. It would have been a good time for us to talk about the ugly things that stood between us, but we didn't. The part of me that wanted closure and acceptance wasn't as strong as the part of me that just wanted everything to be okay, and and I was beginning to realize that maybe you never really got closure. It was better to live in harmony and to love and appreciate my father for the work that he'd done and the story he had told about our lives. A short story was picked up by the truck in the middle of August, and Mom and I followed the truck down to Florida in my station wagon, the Shadow's replacement. I would have liked to have made the trip down the Intracoastal, but my jobs in Ocean City were too lucrative to justify taking the month off. Plus, I was afraid that the trip would take longer than planned and that I would miss my first week of classes at FIU. The truck pulled into a boatyard in a residential section of Fort Lauderdale, and Mom and I parked and watched as the truckers, a husband and his wife team, who did an excellent job, inspected the boat and transitioned her into the boatyard travel lift, a large piece of industrial machinery that lifts vessels by positioning straps underneath them and then wheels them to the launch where they are dropped into the water. Short Story was covered in road dirt and stripped of all her rigging, and everything was tied and strapped down to endure the hurricane force winds of the interstate. Fort Lauderdale was hot, but the tropical smells and the humid Gulf Stream air made me feel alive as I watched my sailboat being placed into the new river. I hopped aboard and started the engine to move the boat over to the slip where she would stay for a couple of days while we put everything back together and got ready for the trip down to Mall Lake Marina in North Miami Beach. "Let's get the air conditioning on," Mom said as she stepped aboard and climbed down the companionway. A carpenter friend of my parents had fashioned a brace that fit into the bottom part of the companionway and into which you could fit a small window unit AC system. As long as it was tilted so that the condensation ran out into the cockpit rather than into the cabin, it cooled the boat perfectly and was one of those genius things that I could never have lived aboard a small boat in South Florida without. We turned it on and relaxed for the first time in days as the cool air filled the cabin. I looked around the inside of the boat and admired it. The small settee was an efficient use of space on the port side of the main salon, and a fully enclosed head was positioned just forward of the settee. The whole starboard side was dedicated to the galley, where the two-burner alcohol stove sat atop a custom cutout where Marlin had installed a microwave, forward of which was a small sink and then an ice box, which my parents had converted into a refrigerator for me. Then there was a hanging locker, and then the V-berth, my comfortable, cozy, book-lined V-berth that had an insert placed between the berths, making one end into a queen-size bed, while the other end tapered into a V at the anchor locker in the bow. Two brass reading lamps and a small shelf on which sat a CD player completed the room where I would sleep for the next 5 years. Short Story's twin quarter berths were packed with stuff, the books and the clothes and belongings that I hadn't quite figured out where to store, and my mom's travel bags, but otherwise the small boat was uncluttered, clean and comfortable inside. Mom and I cracked open a bottle of warm white wine to celebrate our landing in South Florida. "I'm envious of you," Mom said. "I'm envious of me too," I said. Some time that evening it occurred to me that I should check the bilge to make sure that it was still dry. Unlike most bilges, Short Stories had always been bone dry, with the keel bolts firmly and solidly attached. I pulled up the floorboard in the main salon and peered in. There was about 4 inches of water in my boat's bilge. What the hell? I grabbed a flashlight off the counter and looked again, dipping my hand into the water and licking my finger just to be sure that it was salt water and not the result of a leaky freshwater tank. It tasted salty. Mom was staring too, and she repeated the dipping and licking just to verify my diagnosis. Could the keel bolts have loosened on the drive? You know, I did see some rust stains that I don't think were there before. I said I'd seen them and pretended not to. Streaks of rusty water that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere on the boat's keel. Well, let's pump it out and see what happens, Mom said. So we did, and a few hours later the water level had risen again. We pumped again and dried the area and the bolts meticulously. I held a flashlight and watched as water pooled in the tiny cracks around the bolts and beaded up from out of nowhere in the bilge. It looks like it's just kind of seeping in from everywhere, I said. I sat on the floor and felt my heart sink, and my mind start to jump from one scenario to another. My new boat would sink with my mother and me aboard. We'd have to be rescued halfway to Mall Lake, and I'd missed my first week of classes at grad school because I'd be stuck in a boatyard. I was supposed to meet with the faculty member I'd been assigned to for my teaching assistantship the next day, a professor named Don Wakefield, about whom I knew nothing except that I would be helping him teach a large lecture class on the literature of culture of New York City during the 1950s. I didn't know anything about New York during the 1950s, but the beats were appealing to me. Mom and I slept for a few short hours, and in the morning the water level had risen to about 6 inches. She told me that she would take care of things while I went and met with my professor, so I showered in the marina showers while wearing my flip-flops and changed into an outfit that I deemed somewhat professional, a skirt and blouse and low heels. I drove to North Miami Beach and stopped at Mall Lake on my way to drop off my check for the first month's dockage. The marina's owner eyed me in a suspicious but bored way, as if he'd seen every type imaginable walk through the office doors to drop off the first month's rent. At FIU, Dan Wakefield welcomed me into his office and told me how much he'd loved my thesis from undergrad, a novella named Divers, which I had used as my writing sample for my grad school applications. It was about a married woman who worked at a bait shop in West Ocean City, Maryland, and had an affair with the guy who delivered ice to the shop. It was thick with imagery and the rough details of the life in the commercial harbor. It seemed like it was written by someone much older, Professor Wakefield told me. He was in his 70s, and the class was based on his personal experience as a writer coming of age in New York City during the 50s. He told me to call him Dan and gave me a pile of books to read and things to photocopy for our first class, which would be next week. I liked him immensely. Back in the boat, Mom greeted me with an encouraging smile. I talked to Dad, she said. He's heard of this kind of thing before in another cruising boat. He hired a friend to come out tomorrow morning and help us with the fix. We have a list of things we need to buy first, though. She explained the fix. We'd be taking automotive grease fittings and tapping them into the fiberglass around the keel bolts. Then, with a grease gun, we'd inject heavy-duty marine caulking into the glass through the grease fittings. Theoretically, it would seep in through the cracks in the fiberglass and fill the spaces through which the water was leaking. The boatyard had suggested that we haul the boat and have the keel dropped and new bolts embedded into the fiberglass, a fix that would cost, they estimated, $5,000 on a boat that had cost $6,000. This didn't seem like a good idea. I was already paying the yard a fortune to step the mast and had just spent $2,000 having the boat shipped, so my cash supply was dwindling. Mom and I drove around Fort Lauderdale, visiting the same marine supply and automotive shops where Dad and I had searched for parts for the old generator we had rebuilt years ago. We were greeted with the typical condescending offers to help that women who enter such establishments usually receive. Do you know what you're looking for, and are you sure that's what you want? The heat was thick, and we sucked down large iced coffees from Dunkin' Donuts, loaded with sugar and cream. We drove up and down State Road 84, walking through boat owner's warehouse and sailorman in our cutoffs and flip-flops, speaking easily together about small projects that still needed to be done to the boat. The next day we had already screwed the grease fittings into the bilge when my dad's friend showed up to help us. The three of us crouched on the cabin's sole of short story and took turns squeezing the thick caulking into the fittings, watching as beads of it popped up from small cracks in the fiberglass inches away from where it had entered. "It's doing what it's supposed to do," Mom said. We shot more and more in through the fittings until we'd emptied 3 large tubes of caulking into Short Story's bilge. The leak stopped, and Mom and I left the boatyard for Mall Lake early in the morning, before the heat was too oppressive. I drove navigating the winding path of the New River, passing through drawbridges that opened on the hour and half-hour, and staying out of the way of the mega yachts and tugs and working vessels that made up the everyday traffic of the New River. We crossed the inlet at Port Everglades, which we had passed through many times before aboard Cheyenne, and it felt strange to me not to turn and head out to sea, because one of the bridges in Miami was too short for our mast. We had never taken Cheyenne through the stretch of the Intracoastal between Fort Lauderdale and Miami, so passing Port Everglades and heading on through Dania and Hollywood and Aventura was like going someplace entirely new. The turnoff the Intracoastal into Mall Lake was so small it could have been easily missed. We motored up a small canal between condos which opened into a wide lake, spotted with anchored boats and lined with mangroves. The white concrete pilings of the marina were easy to spot, and with Short Story's bow pointed in the direction Mom and I made, the dock lines ready and placed fenders out on either side of the boat. As I took us into the slip on B-dock, idling the motor and coasting most of the way in, I noticed the people gathered in small groups on the dock. They offered to help with the lines, and then they walked away, looking over their shoulders and pondering the mother-daughter team that had just expertly navigated into their world. Celia in Miami, Florida, fall of 2002, age 22. Fuck, it's hot, I thought. The sheets bunched around my feet, up at the end of the V-berth where Celia's feet rested, one on top of the other, touching mine, because there was no way to avoid touching in a bed as small as the one on Short Story. Her legs were tangled in the sheets, and the full moon coming through the open forward hatch cast a swath of light across the bed and over her breasts. I wished she would cover them up, and I wished she wouldn't. The South Florida September heat barely lifted at night. I flipped onto my back and imagined waking Celia up and taking her out to the cockpit and going for a night swim in the Oleta River, or pouring buckets of salt water over each other until we cooled off. I wondered whether Short Story's anchor was holding. It had seemed to set just fine. We anchored directly off the Florida International University campus, where the Oleta River fed into Biscayne Bay. We'd had martinis for lunch and wine for dinner. Celia had driven over from St. Petersburg to see me. She was younger than me and had seemed so naive when I'd given her shots of tequila in the dorm at Eckerd College. She still had a goddess body. She was out cold from the wine. She mumbled something I couldn't understand and turned to face me, her breast spilling onto the sheets and her brown hair softly wrapping around them. I wanted to reach out and touch her and run my hands along her soft and glowing skin. Short story spun on her anchor chain as the current shifted in the anchorage, and a night heron called somewhere in the mangroves. I pulled myself out of bed, careful not to wake her, and climbed out of the companionway. I sat in the cockpit and looked at the night sky, too bright with the moon and the city lights of Miami. Ashore, the cars hummed as they rolled by on US 1, just west of the FIU campus. I took a beating on one of the buildings and a city light behind it and watched for them to move in relation to each other. But they didn't. Short Story's anchor was fixed to the bottom. I could have folded the settee down into a bed and made Celia sleep there. I could have put her in the quarter berth, but the V berth was the most comfortable place on the boat. My mother and I had shared it only weeks earlier. However, Celia and my mother were two very different people, and I didn't think I'd be able to get back to sleep up there with her. I drifted off in the cockpit. I woke up sweating at 7 in the morning. Celia was still asleep, so I moved around on the deck as softly as I could. I pulled in the anchor line hand over hand, coiling it on the bow until the remaining line met the water at a right angle, and the anchor was directly underneath the hull and still buried in the sand below. I slipped back to the stern and started the outboard, idling it as low as it would go without dying, and returned to the bow to pull the anchor and the rest of the way up. I leaned back against the weight of the line, expecting to feel the soft pop as the anchor let go of the sand. Nothing happened. I rested a few seconds and tried again. I'd put the anchor down while the boat was in the slip and pulled it back up just for practice, and the anchor and chain together weighed no more than 40 pounds. I leaned over the bow and looked at the white nylon line where it disappeared into the murk. I didn't want to have to dive on it. "Hi," Celia said. She sat on the cabin in her bikini top and gym shorts, brown strings of her hair clinging to her cheeks. "I think I got attacked last night." She smothered her hands over her thighs, which were red with mosquito bites. "I'm sorry, we should have stayed at the dock." "No, I'm glad we got to take the boat out." She cupped her hand over her mouth and yawned. "I feel like I know you a lot better now. I've seen you doing what you do best and what you love to do, and it's beautiful." "We are stuck," I said. "I can't get the anchor up." "I'm sure you can." I braced my legs against the bow pulpit and pulled again, stretching the line so tight I wondered if it would snap. After a few more yanks, it gave a few inches, and I could see the chain where it was spliced to the nylon. Celia stood next to me and stared into the water. A dusky, angular shape had appeared just beneath the chain. "What do you think it is?" Celia asked. "I can't tell." I pulled at the anchor some more, and the thing rose a few more inches. "I'm going to get into the dink and see if I can get a better grip on it." I cleated off the line and brought the dinghy around from the stern. Celia watched as I climbed in and kneeled in the bilge, keeping my center of gravity low for stability. I reached into the water, leaning so far that it came up to my shoulders, and grabbed the anchor line. Tiny bubbles formed on my arm hairs and let go, spinning to the surface. I leaned back into the dink and pulled the line in a few more inches. "Can you take in the slack?" I held the line with every muscle in my body and watched Celia wrap the line around Short Story's small cleat. After a few more heaves and wraps, I could see the anchor and the thing it had snagged, a tangle of old lines covered in barnacles and muck, all wrapped neatly around an underwater cable. It looked less ominous near the surface. "What do you think it's from?" Celia handed me the boat hook before I had a chance to ask. "Probably somebody else caught their anchor on that cable and just cut it loose, or maybe it's from a sunk boat." I wondered how many boats had been abandoned and sunk or lost in hurricanes in the murky waters of northern Biscayne Bay, and Mole Lake. As I pried at the cable with my boat hook, Celia dropped the anchor a few feet while I held the cable, and Short Story was free. We pulled back into the slip at Mole Lake Marina half an hour later, both sweaty and needing showers. Celia handled the dock lines like a pro. I watched her duck beneath the shrouds as she walked one of the spring lines to the cleat in the stern. Thunderclouds hung over the Everglades to the west, rumbling and announcing themselves, even though it was still too early in the morning for the storms I'd come to expect every day during the South Florida summer. A small crowd of men had gathered on the dock in front of Short Story. I wondered why they hadn't offered to catch our lines, the standard marina code of conduct, but it didn't bother me. Did y'all have fun? The oldest one was slightly overweight and had a white Hemingway beard. His jeans were held up with green suspenders, and he smiled as he stepped closer to my boat and did the same thing I always did when I saw a boat I'd never seen before. He looked up at the top of the mast and scanned down, taking in the lines and probably calculating hull speed and the year she was built and all the rest of the specs. "I'm Rob," he said. "That's my boat." He pointed to the beautiful ketch in the slip next to me. I introduced myself and Celia and told him he had a gorgeous boat. "Where'd you go?" The second man was younger but gaunt and unhealthy looking. A mangy black dog sat on the dock next to him and scratched its neck. We anchored off FIU for the night," I said, suddenly aware that I had nothing on but a faded bikini top and cut-off jeans. I pulled the jeans down over my thighs, where they tended to creep up and stick to my skin where it was hot out. "That's a pretty anchorage," Rob said. The rest of them, 5 in all, stood back and nodded. We got the anchor caught on a cable, but other than that, it was nice. I hopped into the dink to bail it and tie it up properly. "So, are you here for the long run?" The skinny one with the dog sat down and swung his feet over the dock. "Depends on how long that is," I said. "Well, I've been here 8 years now. Some people have been here for 20. "Not that long," I said, "just until I finished school. A few years." "What are you studying?" Rob asked. I decided I would call him Captain Rob. "Creative writing," I said. "You'll have a lot to write about here," said the skinny one. "See that boat over on A dock?" He pointed to a weirdly misshapen Catalina 22 that looked like the hull had been chopped in half and then built up for more headroom. "That guy's a male prostitute. I mean for guys." "Oh." I looked at the boat and Celia followed my gaze. I would have to befriend the male prostitute and find out for sure. I'd seen him, a young Latino, climbing on and off his boat late at night, and he seemed friendly enough. "And the people on that houseboat are the ones who've been here for 20 years. They're nuts," he said, "but most everyone on this dock is okay. This is the high-class neighborhood. That's why they stuck you over on C," Captain Rob said. "As soon as a slip opens up here, we are moving, right?" The skinny guy rubbed the black dog behind its ears. They stood there and watched as Celia and I finished stowing everything and hosed the salt and grime off the deck. I wondered how much more they wanted to ask, like what was a 22-year-old woman doing with her own boat, and what had happened between Celia and me out in the anchorage. They'd be disappointed by the truth, I thought, and I was a little disappointed too. Would things have been different if I hadn't fought the urge to touch her? Celia drove home that afternoon, and I sat on the dock and drank a Miller Lite with Captain Rob. "There's a lot of history here," he said. "This place was one of the busiest drug-running spots in the 80s. There used to be high-speed chases out in the lake, and everyone knew Tuna's was the place to go for a party." He pointed at the Marina restaurant. "I wasn't here then." I did more listening than talking, and Mole Lake started to grow on me. That night, the band at Tuna's was just loud enough so I could hear it from Short Stories v. Birth, and the lights in the marina parking lot filtered through the hatch, illuminating the cabin. but something was scraping at the bottom of the boat. I tried to close my eyes and ignore it. It went away for a few minutes and then came back, just below my head. I grabbed the flashlight I kept next to the V-berth and slowly opened the forward hatch and pulled myself through, hooking my arms over the flange and wiggling my body onto the foredeck. Flat on my stomach, I inched to the side of the boat and waited until I heard it again. I swung the beam of my flashlight into the water and leaned out so I could see. A prehistoric-looking boxfish with octagonal scales and tiny fins stared sideways at me and went back to pecking at the hull. I stared at it a few minutes, an eerie feeling creeping over me, thinking, this place is so strange, but it feels right. The people here don't fit in with the rest of the world, but they fit here. This place is perfect for me. Love Spell, North Miami Beach, Florida, spring and summer of 2004, age 24. Life at Mole Lake wasn't defined by the regular patterns that dictate most people's lives. My class schedule was irregular. I took classes and taught classes. When I wasn't at FIU, I was working on the boat, or sleeping, or writing, or drinking on the dock. There was always a party, always a grill going on someone's boat, always a bottle of rum or wine. I tried dating from time to time, but there really wasn't anybody who understood my way of life. It was a careless and independent existence. When a grad school friend of mine explained at a party that he had just paid off all his credit card debt and put a down payment on a condo by borrowing the maximum amount of subsidized and unsubsidized federal student loans that he could, it's practically free money, he said. I filled out my FAFSA and applied for loans. I'd intended on living just off the stipend from my teaching assistantship, but $10,000 a year didn't quite cut it. I should have taken on an extra job, and I did take on extra classes, teaching whatever sections of English composition that I could as an adjunct during summer terms, but the temptation of practically free money was more than I could resist. I borrowed the maximum amount from Sally Mae and never thought twice. In 2004, I tried online dating and met a man from Rhode Island. We discovered that we'd crossed paths when I was 15, and he'd been working at a marina where my family had docked. I vaguely remembered having a small crush on him that summer. Buck and his wife were separated, and I was certain that divorce was just around the corner. We spent a long weekend in the ground floor apartment of a house on a canal in the Keys, and every day we ran out along the reefs in a small Boston whaler. Buck didn't believe me when I told him I could freedive 50 feet, so he dropped me in 55 feet of water and asked me to return with something from the bottom. When I returned with a small limestone rock, he was waiting for me, gray eyes sparkling. He grabbed me by the waist and pulled me towards him, gently removing my snorkel for a kiss. Buck speared a hog snapper later that day, and I watched as he swam up through the water that was almost as clear as the water in the Bahamas. The fish trailed behind him, dangling on the spear and thrashing as its blood spread ink-like through the water around it. 3 barracudas circled underneath Buck, following him to the surface and inching closer to the snapper with each foot of ascension. The water was deep, maybe 40 feet, and I had seen Buck follow the snapper under a ledge, his broad back small underneath all the water. I'd watched him aim and release the spear gun, a contraption that I had never used, as they were illegal in the Bahamas, and as the barracudas followed him up to the surface, and I watched through the hazy blue water, I fell in love. In the evenings at the house in the Keys, we drank Captain Morgan and Diet Coke with the juice of fresh key limes, and I wrapped whatever fish we had caught that day in foil and cooked it Bahamian style with peppers and onions. Buck was in his 30s, but had the look of a much older man. His skin was weathered, and he had a beard that he wore like an old salt. He was reserved by nature, but talkative with me, and I was convinced that after all this time I had met the man I was meant to be with. But the marriage wasn't as close to ending as I thought, and as he made plans to move back to Rhode Island to be with his wife, I summoned up all of my mental energy in my yoga and meditation practice to offer out to the universe in an attempt to change his course. Tammy, my best friend from the marina, and I drove to a botanica in Little Haiti, where we purchased the various accoutrements of a Santeria love spell. The dark and heavy woman behind the counter stared expressionless at the two white blonde women who browsed through the books and charms and figures and oils. Sitting in Short Story's small cabin with candles, a photograph, oils, a small fish figurine, and a piece of Buck's hair laid out on the table in front of me, I drank Captain Morgan and Diet Coke and considered what I was doing. Didn't I have just as much a right as the next person to practice a religion that wasn't mine? My sister and I had been raised to respect other people's religions, and on several Easter Sundays we'd attended service at the Baptist Church on Staniel K. But religion had never been a consistent thing in our lives, so as far as I was concerned, all religion was fair game. I believed in some kind of higher power, but would never have called it God. The spell didn't work, and the meditation didn't work. Buck and his wife stayed together, and I was miserable. I fell while jogging in the Aletta River State Park, and fractured a bone in my elbow shortly afterwards, and I couldn't help wondering if karma was getting back at me for giving away so much of myself to try to win the love of this man, who was never mine to begin with. Or maybe this was my payback for fooling around with a religion I knew little about. Cursing and holding my elbow close to my body, I drove myself one-handed to the FIU clinic, where they sent me off to the emergency room. I finished my final papers for the semester, typing with my left hand and high on painkillers. That summer, I taught a few classes and tried to work on my thesis. I drank boxed wine at lunch every day and moved to rum in the evening. It was a rough time, and I hardly remembered the summer. Fall came, and I got a paid internship for the Miami Book Fair. I woke up at 7 every morning to drive to downtown Miami and sit in a cubicle at Miami-Dade College. This was my second real office experience, and it wasn't as dreary as the office of a cruising world had seemed when I was 15. The people around me talked about books and art, sometimes in English and sometimes in Spanish. I started to pick up a few words and phrases in Spanish and started to feel more comfortable with the city of Miami. The office was right downtown in the Wolfson building of what was then the Miami-Dade Community College, and the Latin kids on their way to and from classes were fresh-faced and smart. They wore trendy shoes and glowed with the hope of boom time in South Florida. They were future businessmen and women who dreamt of condos overlooking Biscayne Bay and luxury hybrid vehicles. Cafe con leche and empanadas were the fuel of choice for us all, and I brimmed over with awe as I made travel arrangements for famous, although sometimes finicky writers. It was an election year, and I attended a John Kerry rally with my classmates in Bayfront Park. Miami was all optimism in 2004. On the last day of the book fair, Buck called me to tell me he was passing through town and wanted to know if I cared to meet up for dinner. I braced myself and pretended to be over him and told him no. I sat on a bench as dark fell on downtown Miami and wondered what would have happened if I had said yes. Hurricanes Francis and Jean Fort Pierce, Florida, summer and fall of 2004, age 25. It was September 2004, in the short weeks between Hurricanes Francis and Jean, and my body was on autopilot. I took the Orange Avenue exit off I-95, slowing my small Mazda, my third car since the Shadow, had been rear-ended and totaled, and the station wagon had blown a head gasket to 20 miles per hour above the posted speed limit on the exit ramp. I didn't think about what I was doing there. I was following some kind of gut instinct, the kind that people try to forget that they have. The marinas around Fort Pierce had reportedly lost over 40 boats in Francis. People were without electricity and water for weeks. Roofs had blown off of houses and businesses. None of the gas stations had any fuel left. The green road signs along I-95 were warped and twisted. I could read some of them, most of them I couldn't. Hurricane Ivan was making its way toward the U.S., having already swept over parts of the Caribbean. It was projected to hit Cuba, then take a slight turn west into the Gulf of Mexico, but the different models showed it making landfall anywhere between the Gulf Coast of Alabama and Miami. I had taken the sails off of Short Story for Francis, tied extra dock lines to pilings 2 slips away, and hauled my dinghy out to the water and set it ashore. It was promptly stolen after the storm. I had removed my computer, my Coast Guard license, a few unfinished writing projects, insurance papers, some photo albums, Grandmom June's engagement ring, the only nice piece of jewelry I owned, and my dog. I went to a friend's apartment in Hollywood and waited for the storm to be over. Now that Ivan was on the way, I had decided to get out of South Florida. I hadn't planned on stopping in Fort Pierce. I was headed to St. Augustine to stay with Carolyn for a few days. She was getting close to graduating from Flagler College and had taken root in the small historic city. I left Miami around noon, and by 2 I was trying to find my way to downtown Fort Pierce. I felt guilty for being there. The people I passed stared straight ahead with blank, shocked faces, and I thought they looked like they were waiting for nature to reverse itself somehow, for the winds to come back and blow their roofs back on, to fix their windows and unflood their houses. I stopped across from the city marina, not wanting to park too close. I wasn't sure why, maybe because I didn't want anybody to see me. This was about me, and I didn't feel like running into my parents' friends or friends of mine from my days with Carrie in the sport fishing circuit. I unloaded Stella, the beagle I had ended up with 1 year into grad school the same summer I broke up with Carrie, and shuffled over to the marina. Shane New was supposed to be here somewhere. The new owners had emailed my dad after Francis, telling him that Shane New, now Sea Fox, had been damaged in the storm and that they were waiting until the marina cleared the other damaged boats out of the way so they could move it into a yard for repairs. I hadn't seen the boat since New Year's Day 1999. I wasn't sure if I wanted to see it now, but somehow had made me turn off at Orange Avenue and drive down to the water. Stella and I made our way across the marina. The air was oppressive and sweet with dead fish. I felt the dust lodging behind my contact lens, and my legs itched. Stella started coughing violently, bracing her paws on the deck. A small group of people from the tiki bar stared. "It's okay," I said. "She's asthmatic." She wasn't, but this was an easy explanation that seemed to work whenever her trachea collapsed in public. You learn how to make excuses very quickly when you own a beagle. There was yellow tape strung across the entrance to the dock office, and beyond the office more yellow tape blocked off the dock. I wondered whether the police thought the tape would really be enough to keep boat owners away. I ducked under it and listened for an alarm or siren or somebody to yell at me and tell me that it was unsafe to proceed. Right after Hurricane Andrew, my family had docked at Chub Cay in the Berry Islands. Andrew had passed over the Bahamas before it ripped into South Florida, doing as much or more damage to the unprotected islands as it did to Homestead. At Chub, dogs and cats lay dead all over the marina, electrocuted from walking into puddles of water charged with electricity from the live wires that stuck out of the ground, sometimes as invisible as blades of grass. The marina had smelled worse than rotting fish. It smelled like people's dead pets. We stayed aboard Chenu, my parents assuring my sister and me that it would be just as easy for one of us to be electrocuted and killed as it had been for the rotting dogs and cats. I thought about this as I stepped over a huge gap in the concrete dock and around a puddle, leading Stella on a short leash. Chenu was right on the other side of the dock, with her bow to the marina office. I couldn't think of her as Sea Fox for some reason. There was nothing wrong with the new name, and the new owners had lived aboard and treated her well, but a new name couldn't erase the 19 years of history between this boat and me. Behind her, boats were piled on top of each other. A large motor yacht, maybe 65 feet long, sat with her whale-like belly and one of her props on the neighboring dock. A few of the floating docks had broken up, and wedges of concrete filled the spaces between holes, as snugly as if they belonged there. The scene was like a puzzle, with fiberglass and concrete and twisted metal wrapped intricately together. In the middle of the puzzle, Chenu held her proud bow over the dock. Her mast was crooked because the whole boat had been pushed sideways by a piece of dock, but she was the most intact piece of fiberglass there. I braced myself, wondering what it feels like to be electrocuted, then reached for Chenu's stainless steel bow rail. I couldn't see any live wires, but you can never be sure. I figured if it was my time to go, then I would have to accept my fate, and I hoped that, if I got electrocuted, somebody would rescue Stella. Nothing happened. The rail was cold and smooth, but not charged. I tied Stella's leash to it and stepped aboard, over the anchor windlass and around the roller furling gear. I made my way back to the cockpit and checked to see whether the companionway hatch was locked. I knew that going inside would be officially considered breaking and entering, but I was ready to go to jail if necessary. It was locked. I rattled the padlock and looked around for a key, but gave up when a sudden wave of guilt swept over me. This wasn't my boat. I had no right to be here. I left the cockpit and went back to the stern, where the worst of the damage was. The stern rail was twisted off, and the starboard davit had been ripped out of the hull. It had been attached with bolts to a heavy backing plate, but the plate had been pulled straight through the fiberglass, leaving a jagged hole almost a foot across. My dad had installed the davits the second year we went south, to hold the Boston whaler skiff that we later replaced with an ugly-as-hell but practical and tough aluminum dinghy. Still, the damage wasn't too bad. Every other boat in the marina seemed to be worse. The boat right behind Chenu had a smaller boat on top of it. The bow pulpit of one rammed into the cabin windows of the other. The damage on Chenu was cosmetic, nothing that couldn't be repaired. I wondered if it would be feasible for me to buy the boat, dirt cheap, and spend a few years fixing it up. But I only had about $100 in the bank, and I had at least 2 more years of school ahead of me. Stella howled from the bow, and I made my way back to her. Back in my car on the way to St. Augustine, I called my parents to tell them about the boat and how the damage wasn't too bad. Ivan hit the Gulf Shore of Alabama, bringing the whole ocean with him, and I drove home to Miami only to prepare for the next hurricane. I didn't know that in Grenada, Cole and his family were surveying the damage to their boats, washed ashore by Ivan. I learned this later when I found a website they had created to show the damage to the boats. Jean hit the Bahamas, and then, when everyone thought she was heading out to sea, where she would lose steam and die, she made an unprecedented loop, crossed back over her original path, and hit Fort Pierce in the middle of night. I slept through the storm in my friend's apartment in Hollywood. Chez Nous was one of the last boats to be pulled out of the marina between Francis and Jean. She, along with several others, was towed out and anchored in the river the day before Jean hit. There wasn't enough time to get her to the boatyard. In the morning after Jean hit, the only thing visible was a mast sticking out of the river, snapped in half. Chez Nous had sunk, her hull breaking in two as hurricane-force winds pounded against her. She had finally been given more than she could handle. I never understand how a boat could live for 25 years, take one family thousands and thousands of miles, go through so much weather, and then sink that easily and completely. I must have somehow known that this would happen. Why else would I have stopped in Fort Pierce to see a boat that I hadn't seen in over 5 years? I always thought that, since the boat was built the year I was born, we had a spiritual connection. Short Story and I were close, but we didn't have the same history. We still had to build one. Misfits of Mall Lake, North Miami Beach, Florida, 2005. Age 25. The lights of Sunny Isle Beach cast a trail across Mall Lake, broken only by masts and hulking wrecks of the boats that had met their fate in the 2004 hurricanes. The boats anchored in Mall Lake had been mostly abandoned, with no working bilge pumps and nobody to care for them, so a little extra rain had sent them to the bottom. If I was in the right mood, I could look out over Mall Lake and see a graveyard for boats, fenced in by the condos of Sunny Isles. Sailing the lake was treacherous. You had to keep a careful eye out for the wrecks, where they inched above the surface like warm water icebergs. We sat on the stern of Tammy's trawler, the Lady T, like we did almost every night, drinking Captain Morgan rum and listening to Jake run his mouth about whatever bullshit he had on his mind. Jake was loud and volatile, a citizen of Mall Lake. "Look at those fuckers over on A dock," he said, waving his drink around and splashing some onto the deck. Tammy, his girlfriend, shrieked and grabbed a paper towel. "I mean, they got stuck over there for a reason. It's just a bunch of freaks and rejects. They don't even have a cable." Captain Rob scratched his beard. "Actually, there are some nice folks over there," he said. "Traitor, maybe you should ask the marina to move you." Jake sat on top of a cooler with a thud. "I like my cable TV." Rob sipped from the thermos he kept full of Bloody Mary mix and vodka. Somehow B-Doc was the only one with cable. The previous dockmaster, who lived on sea, had strung an underwater cable between the docks to her hulking ferro cement ketch, which had since been abandoned in the lake. When I'd moved to the marina in 2002, she told me I was getting put in the best slip around. She'd been evicted in early 2004 when the Loggerhead Club, a fancy marina chain that bought up run-down marinas all over South Florida, moved in. "Seriously, Rob," Jake said, "look at what you've got over there. You've got Grant and Betty rotting on that houseboat with those mangy dogs. You've got that boat with no mast. I heard it ran into a bridge in Palm Beach over a year ago, and they haven't fixed it yet. Now you've got those hippies on that little sailboat. I mean, how can they live like that? I bet they don't even have a toilet." Hippies. I scanned A-Dock, its pilings and boats, shadows in the Miami night. He's talking about that couple on the little Erickson that just moved in. "Boats about the size of yours," Rob said. "Are they living aboard?" "Seems that way. Good for them. I'd have to go over and introduce myself." They couldn't be half bad living on a little sailboat like that. I never got around to it though. A dock, in many ways, was a world away from B dock, and unless you had a reason to go over there, well, you just didn't. I'd gone over once before to see the male prostitute's boat, more because I was curious about what the inside of a terribly modified Catalina 22 looked like than because I wanted to hang out with him. I never found out whether he was indeed a male prostitute, but it was likely, since the park right next to the marina was a known meet-up place for the gay underworld in North Miami. Now the boat sat abandoned and derelict, like so many others up in the mangroves. There was an extra pair of flip-flops on Aaron's back deck the next morning. Aaron was a Coast Guard pilot who'd just gotten divorced and moved into the slip next to mine. "What do you think?" Jake asked. "Size 6. He coughed and tossed his cigarette butt into the lake, which was dirty as sin from all the construction. It was 11 in the morning on Saturday, and we were standing on the dock behind Aaron's boat. "I don't know," I said. "They look about the right size for Texas." Texas was the married chick that Aaron had over every once in a while. Her name wasn't really Texas, but none of us were very good with names, so we just said whatever came to mind. She was from Texas, and the last time I saw her, she had a t-shirt on with Texas stretched over her boobs. I thought it looked good on her. "Shit, he's done with her," Jake said. "It can't be Texas." Jake's voice boomed, and people always told him he should hire it out, do voiceovers for the movies. It was deep and scratchy like an old man's who's been smoking all his life, except Jake was one of the youngest people on the dock. He was 36. Tammy had a great voice too. She was from Tennessee, and she had this little kid's high-pitched drawl. She looked like Leanne Rimes, the gorgeous grown-up Leanne, not the child star one. So when she and I went out, we told everyone that she was Leanne, and I was Leanne's manager or best friend, depending on what kind of attention we were trying to attract. Most people in Miami didn't know who we were talking about. "Does Texas know he's done with her?" I asked. "Who the fuck knows?" There was movement on Aaron's boat, and Jake and I pretended to be looking at something else. Aaron's boat was a 26-foot Regal speedboat, one of those pieces of disposable fiberglass that people buy and forget about in a few months. Jake's term for a boat like that was an addict to me. Aaron drove a Corvette too. He was a good-looking guy, but he had bad taste in boats. I jumped aboard. Short story. "Where are you going?" Jake asked. There was no room for privacy on B-Dock. I didn't feel obligated to answer, so I shrugged and swung myself through the companionway. I grabbed Stella by her harness and tossed her out onto the deck so she could stretch her legs. Tammy stood on the dock next to Jake when I returned. She wore a baggy t-shirt that said Captain Morgan on it, and her platinum hair was bed messy. "How are you feeling?" I asked. "Oh, I'm all right, hun," she said. "Are you?" "Sure." "You've got age on your side," Tammy said. I don't know why she always brought this up, because I wasn't that much younger than her. I wish I could still drink like that. Right, Jake? She put her arms around Jake's waist, and I tried to not laugh at them, because last night they'd been fighting like it was all over. I guess that's just how some relationships work. Jake was like a big balding kid, and Tammy made a good mom. The fiberglass door on Aaron's boat slid open, and we tried to look like we were busy playing with Stella, who stood on the bow of my boat howling at Tammy. Tammy howled back. The flip-flops weren't from Texas. They belonged to the new bartender from Tuna's, the Marina restaurant. Tammy rolled her eyes at me, and I said, under my breath, so the bartender wouldn't hear. Next, the bartender saw us all, standing on the dock and fluttered her hand at us in a half-hearted wave. She was dark-haired and beautiful, but she looked like she didn't ever get enough sleep. Aaron followed her out the door, wearing mirrored sunglasses, and he shook his head when he saw us, but I couldn't tell what he was thinking through the sunglasses. The bartender slid on her flip-flops, and Aaron helped her off the boat, and we all watched her walk down the dock, hips swaying as she made her way across the parking lot to Tuna's. She needed a place to stay last night, Aaron said. I wasn't going to send her home. Right, buddy. That's our coastie. Looking out for everyone, Jake said, coughing. Aaron, I think they need to start warning the bartenders up there about you. I said. Tuna's had lost at least 3 bartenders in the past month. They left out of embarrassment or pride, or who knows what. Yeah, Aaron yawned. I'm not that bad, am I? You're all right, I said. It was almost noon, so Aaron and Jake cracked the first beer of the day and sat on the dock box behind Aaron's boat. Tammy and I headed for the air-conditioned cabin of Lady T, Tammy's 40-foot trawler. You're supposed to know about this stuff, Mel, Tammy said. She was pulling off the settee cushions inside Lady T, and she pointed at a spot of water damage on the teak. You can't refinish a spot like this without recoating the whole wall. Damn, she said. She wanted to fix the boat up so she could sell it. You know, I asked my shaman what to do about the boat, and he said it's going to sell really fast. Tammy called a shaman in Tennessee at least once a week. She's told me that I should call him too, that he'll tell me everything that was going to happen in my life. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Have you put the boat up for sale yet? I asked. No, I don't want to pay for the ad in Boat Trader. Tammy clenched her eyes shut and swept her hand across her forehead. Migraine, she said. The Loggerhead Club and a company called Boca Developers had plans to build 22 24-story condominium towers in our parking lot. The construction had already started on the other side of the marina, where the boatyard used to be, and a coat of gray dust clung to the dock, and the boats and our skin reminding us that we were living on borrowed time. The marina would be torn up and privatized as soon as the condos started selling in the mid-2000s in South Florida. Condos were being bought and sold before they were even built. Jake slid the cabin door open, and he and Aaron came inside. He pulled a bottle of rum out from one of the cabinets. You all are going to start drinking that, Tammy said. Damn right. Jake poured a shot from the bottle straight into his mouth. I know Melanie wants some, he said. Not really. A few minutes later, we were all on Lady T's sun deck, and Aaron was lounging back in the deck chair, sitting as far away from me as he could get. Aaron and I didn't really know what to do about each other in small spaces, being the only people single and under 30 in the marina. Jake had a stack of magazines spread out on the chart table. He picked up the latest issue of a boating magazine called Latitudes and Attitudes. Mel, how come that isn't your picture on the cover? He said. He flipped through the magazine, letting the glossy photos of sailors in Fiji and Bora Bora spill across the table. Look, he said, I don't see your name in here. When are you going to get off your ass and do some real writing? Jake, Tammy said. Give her a break. She's in school. She's writing a thesis. Well, I don't see why she can't write for a real magazine, Jake said. Fuck all that literary bullshit. Leave her alone, Jake, Adam said. Why don't you write for Lots and Uts? Maybe I will, Jake said. Tammy laughed. You can barely even write your own name, she said. This may have been true, but he could drive a boat better than almost anybody I knew. I'll be right back, guys. I let myself out through the cabin door and headed down the dock to Short Story. I was planning on just grabbing a Diet Coke from my icebox, but when I reached the boat, there were too many cords running from my boat to the dock. One of my professors, when she'd visited the marina, had said, "So it's just like the books. Boat people really do sit around and drink and hit on women all day." She was so right and yet so wrong at the same time. The cable TV came off, then my phone line. I climbed below and turned off the AC and my computer, and I unplugged the 30-amp master power cable and coiled it on the dock. My freshwater hose was next, and by the time I'd finished unplugging things, I was laughing. 4 separate umbilical cords had been connecting my boat to the dock. No wonder I never went sailing anymore. The Honda outboard started, and I shifted into reverse and then forward to make sure the linkage was okay. I let it run a while until the dock lines, and I untied the dock lines and removed my canvas sail cover. I worked as quietly as I could. I didn't want help casting off. I didn't want a big show when I left the slip. I backed out, trying hard not to overwork the tiller. Stella ran up and down the deck, so excited she forgot to bark. Captain Rob popped his head out of the hatch of his boat and waved at me, grinning. Jake and Tammy and Aaron didn't see me slide past the end of B-Dock. Once I was clear of the marina, I pointed into the wind and climbed up on deck to raise my mainsail. I cut the motor off and fell into a nice beam reach. Short Story's bow cut through the water, and I eased off on the main sheet as I weaved through the derelict boats in the anchorage. The only sound were the water against my hull and the hum of the wind, scooping around my mast and into the sail and sliding across the rigging. As I made another pass by the marina, I heard Jake's voice booming over the water and Tammy yelling something and laughing. Aaron's voice was quieter than theirs, but I knew he was still there, laughing at Jake's jokes and telling them all about the chick he had aboard last night. At that moment, it was nice to be alone with my beautiful boat. I rested my hand on the warm fiberglass and felt the vibrations of sail and water and life move up through my arm. I loved this boat, loved her. "Boat love," I whispered. "I have you, and I am where I want to be."